Thank you very much indeed, and apologies for not being here this morning. I had to teach and couldn't get out of it, I'm afraid, so I'm really sorry to have missed the discussion, which I suspect might have rendered some of what I say irrelevant or unnecessary. I hope not completely. But the paper also builds inadvertently on Sally's paper, so there are certain continuities, and it too is about overwork to some extent. Apologies finally for not having any images. You just have to listen, I'm afraid, and not look. So for reasons that will eventually become clear, i.e. the next 15 or 20 minutes, even though my focus in this talk is on the late 19th century, I begin it by citing a recent novel set in the early 21st century, and that's Joshua Ferris's To Rise Again at a Decent Hour from 2014. Ferris's funny, his infuriating narrator, who's called Paul O'Rourke, is a successful dentist with a practice on Park Avenue in New York City. He's a melancholic and a neurotic, and the chief symptom of his apparently congenitally uncomfortable relationship with life, which is undoubtedly an extremely privileged one in material and in social terms, is his insomnia. Every night, he comments at one point, reflecting on yet another terminally interrupted sleep, was a night of limitless possibility expired, of a life forfeited, of a foreclosed opportunity to expand, explore, risk, hope, and live. And then he goes on. These were my thoughts as I tried falling back asleep. Inside my head, where I lived, wars were breaking out, valleys flooding, forests catching fire, oceans breaching the land, and storms dragging it all to the bottom of the sea, with only a few days or weeks remaining before the entire world and everything sweet and surprising we'd done with it went dark against the vast backdrop of the universe. The chances of me falling back asleep again were nil once more. I got out of bed. He's a sort of Woody Allen character, and in fact people keep mistaking him for being Jewish, and he's not, as the name Paul O'Rourke might suggest. So at night for Paul O'Rourke, there's a kind of apocalypse in his head. Here's the characteristic consciousness of the insomniac, a sort of sealed laboratory in which a mental chaos that's equivalent to some ecological cataclysm is unleashed at night. Now, people, obviously enough, have suffered from insomnia for millennia, perhaps since the creation of the vast backdrop of the universe, to use Paul O'Rourke's phrase. After all, God laboured for 6 days with no rest in order to create the world. And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had made, and he resteth on the seventh day from all his work which he had made, in Genesis 2:2. And people have, of course, written about insomnia or sleeplessness for millennia. So in the mid-4th century BCE, for example, Aristotle wrote his short treatise on sleep and sleeplessness, though its focus on sleep perception, or sense perception rather, more properly makes it about sleeping and waking, I think, or sleepfulness and wakefulness than sleepfulness itself. But only since the second half of the 19th century, it seems, or the later 19th century more specifically, have there been insomniacs as such. Before then, there was no clear diagnostic label or identity for the person who found themselves on a chronic basis unable to sleep. At the end of the 19th century, the insomniac emerged both as a pathological type, albeit one who generally exhibited a number of other psychological or physiological symptoms, and as a kind of social archetype, one that, in the case of various writers and artists, was invested with a certain romantic sentiment and a certain idealization, I think. Of course, it's not difficult to identify insomniacs avant la lettre. Perhaps the earliest, most eloquent of these is the prophet Job. In the Hebrew Bible, the book of Job, probably composed in the 6th century BCE, provides a vivid description, some of you might know it, of its protagonist's inability to sleep, as in chapter 7, verses 3 to 5, which I'll just quickly quote. So, and this is the King James Version, of course, so am I made to possess months of vanity, and wearisome nights are appointed to me. When I lie down, I say, when shall I arise and the night be gone? And I am full of tossings to and fro unto the dawning of the day. My flesh is clothed with worms and clods of dust. My skin is broken and becomes loathsome. As an autobiographical account of insomnia, this has scarcely been bettered in the 2,500 years or so since it was written, I think. The longing for the night to end, the guilt and exhaustion, the tossings to and fro, the feeling, particularly if we annex the fifth verse, the third of those verses I've read out, to the previous two, that one's skin is crawling as if with worms. It's a death in life, and Job is one of the living dead. Here's a man who, in his spiritual battle not to be defeated by this persistent, oppressive sleeplessness, is positively heroic. No doubt it's not an accident, in fact, that though it doesn't refer to sleeplessness itself, the epigraph that Joshua Ferris, chooses for to rise again at a decent hour, the novel with which I started, is in fact taken from Job, specifically chapter 9, verse 25, ha, ha, H-A, H-A in the King James Version, or ha-ha. But he takes it in a kind of Woody Allen-ish way as a ha-ha, ha-ha. In the King James Version, the verse in full runs as follows. He saith among the trumpets, ha, ha, and he smelleth the battle afar off, the thunder of the captains and the shouting. So inside Paul O'Rourke's head, where he lives, you'll recall, wars are breaking out, valleys flooding, the kind of apocalyptic scenes that Job describes are all unfolding. But as I've hinted, it's not until the later part of the 19th century that the term insomniac appears in the English language to identify a person who's incapable of sustained sleep for sustained periods. Prior to that point, sleeplessness was, as it no doubt, this kind of generalization will be very quickly shot down, or at least complicated by discussion and by references to what I've missed already this morning. Prior to that point, sleeplessness was, as it remained for Freud, little more than a symptom of other mental or spiritual conditions. From the fin de siècle, however, the term insomniac was used not simply as an adjective, but as a noun, indicating that the sleepless individual had acquired and would to an increasing extent develop a recognizable identity as someone substantially defined by the chronic experience or morbid condition, as it tended to be called, of insomnia. If sleeplessness historically had described a temporary aberration, to appropriate the vocabulary used by Michel Foucault to understand homosexuality in his History of Sexuality, if to do so isn't to trivialize his work and his polemic, then the insomniac, in his phrase, talking about the homosexual, was now a species. There was something like a discursive explosion around sleeplessness in the second half of the 19th century, as Sally has already established, I think. And in that context, that phrase discursive explosion is from Foucault. And in this context, the insomniac became what Foucault describes as a personage, a case study. A certain biopolitics of sleep, in other words, becomes apparent at the end of the 19th century, the turn of the 20th. So what might be called the speciation of the insomniac, who evolves from among an increasing number of competing pathological types, takes place at this time. Sleeplessness becomes not merely a symptom of some underlying medical, social or psychological condition, but a disease of modern life in its own right. And as such, Sally again has explained, it's susceptible to specific treatment. So a pseudo-medical cottage industry emerges, offering to manufacture and market cures. And in this way, it reinforces the identity, of course, of the insomniac. In a collection of adventure stories entitled Dead Man's Tales from 1898, the Australian novelist Charles Junior momentarily registered this shift in the idiom of popular fiction, specifically their sort of cowboy short stories. Ha! This is a quotation from the end of one of his short stories from a character. Ha! Another ha. There are lots of ha's in this. Only one here. Ha! How the world of science moves. The drunkard is hypnotized into sobriety. The sex maniac grows to loathe his former impulses. The kleptomaniac becomes honest. The insomniac snores in his heavy sleep. Very early use of the word insomniac as a noun. Especially in a metropolitan setting, again, this comes back to things that Sally said, where both labour and leisure hours were subject to peculiar pressures, and where new technologies of illumination, as well as changing patterns of production and consumption, were transforming the relations between day and night. Insomnia became symptomatic at the turn of the 20th century, the end of the 19th, of the lived experience of capitalist modernity. It was a symptom of the acceleration and intensification of everyday life, the extension of everyday life, perhaps, into the night. To offer a brief example, let's turn to an entry on sleeplessness in the British Medical Journal from September 1894. The subject of sleeplessness, I'm quoting, is once more under public discussion, says the anonymous columnist. The hurry and excitement of modern life is quite correctly held to be responsible for much of the insomnia of which we hear. And most of the articles and letters are full of good advice to live more quietly and of platitudes concerning the harmfulness of rush and worry. So very little has changed there. The OED identifies 1908 as the year in which the term insomniac is first used in print as a noun. It cites a lecture on sleep and sleeplessness delivered the previous year at the Great Northern Central Hospital by Alexander Morrison, physician to the Children's Hospital at Paddington Green in London, not, in fact, to be confused with the more famous Scottish physician and alienist of that name, who died in the 1860s. It opens this lecture and its printed version by admitting that it's probably because defective sleep is associated with so many states that textbooks of medicine, notwithstanding its importance as a symptom of disturbance and cause of still further exhaustion, do not treat it fully under one heading. Now, already we've seen that isn't quite true from Sally's talk, but so be it. In the course of this disquisition, Morrison distinguishes what he calls the neurotic insomniac, and that's my concern here. That's the example given in the OED. What he does, Morrison, is he tries to discuss sleeplessness, insomnia, under one heading. Discussing, he says, so far as he can, the factors which underlie sleep and wakefulness, the discrimination of one type of sleep from another, the significance and prognosis of different varieties of sleeplessness, and the rational treatment of that condition. And as I say, in the course of that, he identifies three different insomniacs, the most important of which really is the neurotic insomniac, who most clearly manifests certain decisive symptoms of sleeplessness, namely for him higher body temperature as compared to efficient or normal sleepers, quicker visceral actions. I might need a scientist to explain that. It sounds like a very odd, slightly sinister euphemism, and more frequent urinary secretion. Interestingly, Morrison goes on to diagnose insomnia, again, the ghost of Sally's paper here, to diagnose insomnia as a middle-class condition. Sleeplessness is, in my experience, and I think I corroborate the general impression, he says, more rare among the poor than among their wealthier neighbours. Sleeplessness, we might add, to the extent that as a symptom it detaches itself from the innovated or the enervated body and comes to define an individual's experience of everyday life, is a kind of privilege, a sort of social privilege. The poor cannot afford insomnia, for however poorly they sleep through the night, it's pointless to complain because they're under compulsion to rise the following day and resume their physical labours. Perhaps women too, we might speculate, are necessarily excluded in the 19th century from the prerogative of calling themselves insomniacs. Caring for an infant or a sick child are simply part of the job, and no one's going to congratulate them on the medical interest of their sleeplessness. Science isn't interested, it seems, but Sally may have come across material that disputes this, in whether women who suffered from interrupted nights can be cured to the point where they snore in their heavy sleep, as Juna, that novelist, that popular novelist I mentioned, put it. The noun insomniac actually crops up some time before 1908, as might be expected. The earliest reference that I've found dates from 2 decades earlier. It appears in a short comic sketch entitled The Insomniac, which appears in Fun, a humorous periodical set up to rival Punch, in 1861, and the piece appears itself in April 1888. We tell the story of the insomniac, it commences, capitalizing the initial letter of the noun, in order that it may encourage those who believe insomnia to be incurable to hope. The story, which is a fairly silly one, centres on an insomniac called Tweddleton, sort of sub-Dickensian name, whom the narrator and his friend encounter one night at a hotel when, worn out by travel, they're hoping for a good night's sleep. This is rendered impossible when they're disturbed on first resting their heads on their pillows by a heavy sound that comes from the room above them. When they beat on this guest's door, he gravely informs them, "I'm subject to insomnia. In fact, I have not slept 10 minutes since the 12th of the month before last." And the sound that they've heard is him pushing balls with his nose backwards and forwards across the floor as an attempt to exhaust himself. This individual, who has that weird, we're told, that weird, hollow look of one who suffers from habitual insomnia, explains that he's not only tried numerous cures for his condition, but has, I quote, "gone to the expense of having the various sleep-inducing expedients which I try, to the number of 736, printed in a little book for gratuitous distribution." His favourite remedy, the narrator reports, involves the insomniac standing on one leg until the blood had all flowed into his right ankle, applying at the same time a mustard plaster to the back of his neck. In the end, a week or so later, the narrator and his companion are involved in a train crash on a night express. The cause of the accident, it transpires, is a signalman who's fallen asleep. And yes, Tweddleton turns out to be the signalman. Only by doing a job that requires him to be awake at night can he guarantee that he'll sleep at night, and as a result become plump and well. Industrial modernity, it seems, demands insomniacs, even if they necessarily render the ordered rhythms that are its ideal vulnerable to the caprices of the individual body and brain. So I want to conclude just in the remaining sort of 3 or 4 minutes by returning to a New York City dentist who suffers from insomnia, this time not from the early 21st century but from the late 19th. And here's my case study, so to speak, of the neurotic insomniac. Joseph Albert Kimball, known as Albert, was born in Whitefield, New Haven in 1842. From 1864 to 1865, during the Civil War, he served in the 10th Vermont Infantry and fought for the Union forces as a private until he was discharged, according to the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion from 1870, on account of lacerations of the scalp. Later in the 1860s, he trained as a dentist at the New York School of Dentistry, graduating in 1868. Now, I haven't been able to find out much information about him, particularly about the following 2 decades, but from the late 1880s, 1887, 1888, he seems to have started filing applications for patents for various devices that he'd invented in order to improve the practice of dentistry, including a dental mixing dish and a dental tool holder. And his name appears in a report on a dentist convention printed in the Boston Daily Globe in 1890. His dental practice, presumably a relatively successful one, was located at 50 West 26th Street. And in fact, I managed to find on eBay one of his cards, slightly eerily. In the early 1890s, Kimball set up and edited a specialist journal apparently designed to be chatty and companionable rather than technical, called The Dentist Himself. And the first, and in fact it turns out the only issue, positions this as a kind of, as a sort of therapeutic forum for dentists who feel particularly overworked. I won't go into too much detail about some of this, and we'll skip on to the 2 articles that Kimball himself contributed to that first issue. The first was called Wanted an Office Boy, and it argued that if at all possible that dentists should escape to the countryside because of the pressures of everyday life in the city and the high rents and all that kind of thing, but also the almost sort of existential horror that dentists encounter when they stare into the abyss in the form of a patient's sort of abscess-ridden and rotten mouth. The more substantial article that Kimball writes is called Overwork, in fact, and it repeats some of the points made on the previous page with even greater resentment, brain resentment perhaps, and it hints in mordant tones that colleagues of his are addicted to opium, to chloral, and to cocaine as a means of dealing with the stress. And then he gives a kind of a case study of his own, in effect. It refers to a friend and mentor, but he might as well be talking about himself, describes his toilsome days, his sleepless nights, his haggardness. And then he goes on and makes a kind of confession of his own, which is what I'll focus on very briefly in the final sort of 90 seconds. Not blessed, he says, with a robust constitution. I've repeatedly broken down from overwork. I've been a dyspeptic, a hypochondriac, an insomniac. That last word might not be in the dictionary, but it ought to be. I feel its forceful application to my case. For weeks, and in the aggregate for months, what little sleep I obtained was that which came like a sort of swoon from utter exhaustion or was secured through recourse to drugs. I felt 1,000 times that I would gladly exchange city life for that of the lonely backwoodsman or the small farmer at the end of a country road. So he idealises, in slightly cliched terms, this rural existence, but there's nothing cliched about his coinage of the term insomniac. I am an insomniac, he says. Like the unnamed mentor that he talked about before, he later goes on to talk about the terrible sensation of being conscious that he was breaking down and yet unable to prevent it. And in fact, tragically, he himself must have been in a state of very severe psychological collapse by this point, because a few months later, in August of that year, 1892, aged only 49, he killed himself at his office by chloroforming himself and then cutting his throat with a razor. And he left behind a wife, Eugenia, several children, and a suicide note in which he sort of declared his love for them, and he explained that he felt that it was a choice between suicide or the lunatic asylum, so exhausted was he. Now, insomnia clearly wasn't the prime cause of his suicide, but it evidently exacerbated his existing psychological, perhaps physical problems, perhaps ones that even date back to those lacerations on the scalp in the Civil War. We can speculate that his inability to sleep was one symptom, but perhaps the dominant one possible cause too, of his climactic crisis. In identifying as an insomniac, Kimball became a new kind of martyr, a tragic one to the condition of chronic sleeplessness. With Job, whose patience, as the King James Bible has it, or endurance, as more modern translations tend to have it, is less evident in the book of Job than in the New Testament book of James, in fact. With Job, Kimball might have said, I was not in safety, neither had I rest, neither was I quiet, yet trouble came. And I will leave it there.